So what I'm going to talk about, and I should actually say, why did the world fall in love with Danish TV drama and most likely also other Nordic drama? But that was a bit too long. Because what we found out when we went around the world asking people was that it was a big mess. They actually did not know if they were watching. Sometimes they didn't even know they were watching Nordic European drama, but sometimes it got mixed up a little bit with Belgian drama. And seeing as we investigated Danish TV drama, that's what I'll stick to. But most of these things would probably also go for other Nordic dramas. So we went out into these 8 countries around the world. Sanne helped me. Brazil, Argentina. Sanne was a big part of the study as well. The US, Brazil, Argentina, Japan, Turkey, Australia, Germany, the UK, and Denmark itself, because we needed a reference point somehow to see where the international audience is different from the Danish audiences. Okay, so yeah, it's a bit of the background. So the short answer, I was being very sort of woohoo yesterday when I was preparing it. But the short answer is that the Danish series speak to international audiences' fantasies of realism, authenticity, and a better, more equal world. And then there's a little in which the audiences themselves can imagine them to be living. So it's so it's this fantasy that I'll come back to, because it really is a fantasy. It's also, even when you look at the texts actually, but also if you look at Danish society. Okay, so bear with me. So first of all, I should maybe do a disclaimer. All the audience quotes that I'm going to feature here are from the Australian study, but I think most of them would be found in various in variations across the world, and of course in some countries there are also very different findings. But I'm sort of trying to sum up some of the main findings that we can probably say were present in all the countries. But all the quotes are Australian, and that's because the Australian audience study was the one I conducted, so that's the one I'm most familiar with. So the audiences seem to prefer the Danish stories over especially the American stories. Like, the stories are nowhere near like the American, and for some reason the American stories are always like CSI and stuff like that. They're never like other great American shows. But yeah, so the Danish stories or the Danish series seem to be very preferred over the American series for sure by almost all of our audiences, and it comes up repeatedly again and again and again. And also sometimes in some countries their own local series, their own local stories, especially in Australia. So this is just a quote to illustrate that. The respondents keep pointing to the Danish TV drama series as real, emotionally gripping, surprising, and again very unlike American drama. And for some reason, because they were all these things, it didn't matter that they might be quite culturally removed from them. Here's another quote. Like, I can read it out. I don't think, this is the Australian series, are reflective of how people live their lives. I think this is a very important point. Whereas I find British and European stuff to be more real, more realistic, and more relevant to how people live now, say it's contemporary. They deal with real issues in a very realistic way, whether it's drugs or sex or troubled, youth. There's very little Australian stuff that's relevant, and that's what really resonates particularly with a lot of British and European stuff. It's realistic and it's relevant. Yeah. Another respondent said, very sort of poignantly, he said, Australian series are behind Australian society. They haven't caught up. So even when they're trying to be realistic, Australian series haven't caught up with how society is, how women are in Australian society, and so forth. Yeah. And this attraction of the Danish series and the inbuilt critique of especially American series, and in some countries also local series, seemed very strongly connected to how the characters were thought to be portrayed in a more multifaceted and realistic way. So it all came back to the characters often. Which brings me to sort of the next headline in my presentation: emotional life-world proximity and a sort of a universal realism. So not like a realism, also of course that they think this is real in Denmark, but also a universal realism that they can take and find real themselves in their own lives. So although the series may be culturally removed, they were still very much felt to be emotionally proximate. They somehow strike a chord, an emotional chord with audiences, and in this way they sort of point to some more universal human emotions and condition which seem to transcend cultures. So for example, these two, like the characters drive the drama rather than the plot drives itself. That really makes a difference, because that's something Australia fails at a lot. So that's also still the critique of Australia, but it's also pointing to the characters. And this female says, I think it's why I like most of these things that we're talking about actually. The characters are not all one-dimensional. They've got good, they've got flaws, they're not all bad or all good. They're kind of more normal, more realistic. So she can definitely see herself in the characters. So not only are the characters perceived as more multifaceted and more human, but many respondents also believe they look more real. Good example, Kim, Bosnia. He looks like, us. Like, they look more real, very unlike the glamorous and highly, again they come back to the American, unlike the glamorous and highly stylized characters in American drama series, and sometimes also their own. Yeah. So even though the characters and stories are literally thousands of miles away, at least in the case of our Australian respondents, to many of them, the stories seem very close, or the series seem very close, and like a mirror reflecting the respondents' own lives and their own concerns. For example, this one, I've taken it so many times because he laughs at the end, and I can hear him still. He says, he's deeply flawed, this male. Like, he's really connecting with Kim, I think, or with Martin Rode. He's deeply flawed, he's cheating, and it's all like, you've got a kid and you're just a mess, man. It was great. It was a great character, like good acting, really good acting. So you like had a lot of empathy, even though you're like, man, you're horrible, really. And then he laughs, and it's so clear that he sees, like, yeah, I feel I know this guy by that quote, yeah. Okay. Yeah. So then, sort of, having said all these commonalities, the respondents also, of course, seem very transfixed or enthralled with the otherness on display in the series, which this quote sort of alludes to with words such as edgy, cold, isolated, quiet, veiled. And this otherness takes on many shapes. It can refer to the different aesthetics of the Nordic weather conditions and landscapes, the different ways of behavior, or the societal otherness. And this was actually, I think I have time to tell a little anecdote about this lady. She is also the lady that they were talking about how how these Nordic characters seemed on screen, and then she said, yeah, it's like my boyfriend. He has a Norwegian friend, and they're all a bit Asperger's. They're all a bit Asperger's. And then she looked at me and she realized that, you know, she had sort of forgotten I was not Nordic. Maybe I wasn't acting in the way. And then she just stopped after Asperger's, like. So yeah. So it is definitely an attraction that they see us as quite exotic, and they see the places as quite exotic. So there's this both and thing going on. Yeah. And then to the geopolitics, maybe, Robert, maybe correct me on this, but especially the fascination with the otherness of Danish and other Nordic societies came up repeatedly in the focus group discussion as an attraction with what respondents believed to be a more advanced and progressive society when it comes to, for example, gender equality. It came up again and again and again and again. I think, Sanne, we could probably say it came up everywhere in the world. And this is what Koichi Iwabuchi has termed an aspiration to modernity in 2002. That is, the respondents in Australia would like Australian society to be more like Danish society. And you see this in these two quotes, how this aspiration to modernity surfaces with regards to the perceived differences in treatments of refugees and to the role of women in society, respectively. So this 40-year-old female says they're both they're actually not Nordic noir. Well, they are in the minds of viewers, but they're not, it's both refers to Broen. But they could, it's just because they came out a little bit more coherent, the quotes. But they said very similar things about both The Bridge and The Killing, which were our 3 series that we talked to people about. I was more thinking when I was watching it about some of the social issues, particularly to do with immigration and refugees, which seem to be dealt with in a far more humane way, if you know about Danish politics, real politics. And that was definitely like a sort of wish fulfillment fantasy, especially when we were going through some really brutal politics in Australia at the same time. And that's, of course, the Nauru, where, you know, the Australians, they are, I must admit, they are probably a little bit worse than the Danes. They put their refugees on foreign islands and then they just let them rot up, even kids. So maybe Denmark in that respect is a little bit more humane. But so, and then there's this other male saying the position of power that Birgitte Nyborg is in, and I love the fact that there doesn't seem to be any question that she's a woman. It's very, very rarely brought up in the 3 series. It was never questioned, her strength, because she's a woman. It's very rare. She was just able to get on with her job. And this comes up also about both Saga and Sarah Lund, the 2 other female protagonists in the 2 other series. You can find quotes like this about them, that the fact that they're women is not the issue. It can be all kinds of other issues that are problematic about them. Yeah. So here are the poster images of Danish equality and treatment of refugees, which is really not. We do have quite severe problems with these 2 things. Okay. But then these findings, they sort of challenge this idea of cultural discount, this idea that that content is valued less in foreign markets, that, like, for example, non-English content is valued less in foreign markets as it may not translate so well. These series, they do seem to translate very, very well. So the exoticism and otherness on the one hand become part of the audience fascination with the series, and thus a cultural markup in the minds of viewers, I would argue. And so have we actually, before we did the audience study, Annemite and I in an article. Yeah. Yeah, so these series may very well feel strange to respondents, but this is part of their attraction. Then secondly, the stories and characters essentially seem more authentic and closer to the respondent's societal and personal life world than do America, and even in some cases in the Australian drama series, something which also becomes a cultural markup. And as far as this second point is concerned, it's almost like some of the audiences are othering the self and saming the other. So they're saming, oh, you can't really read it, but they're saming, they're saying, oh, I see myself in Saga, I see myself in the society portrayed in the Danish series, something which I can relate to. It's a little bit like Australian society in some ways, they say that. So they're saming the other, they're saming the Danish series, and at the same time they're othering the self, so they're othering their Australian series, and saying, oh, if you saw, I've chosen really cheesy ones, like Jack Irish and A Place to Call Home, but then, and Stephen is laughing, so you know them. So they're othering their own series in a way, and certainly the American, but that's not maybe so strange. So it's like a kind of reversal cultural proximity. But then, back to my my first argument, the short answer. The fantasy of realism, authenticity, and a better world. When you then look at here it is. When you then look at what the Danish audiences say, it's much more balanced. You have this is the international audiences. I know this is of course also a caricature because they are of course also a little bit more reflective, but still, like, mainly this is the thing they're saying. They're saying the Nordic stuff is over here, authentic, real, gripping stories, good acting, strong women, life well proximity, and then you have the US, or sometimes the local, inauthentic, unreal, flat stories, bad acting, no life well proximity, weak women. Somebody even called the women in the American shows pissy. They're a bit pissy. She's a bit pissy. And yeah, not a very nice word, but very weak women. Danish audiences were much more balanced. For example, when talking about the stories and aesthetics, more of the same, like it's repetitive, a bit too unrealistic. Crimes and the general story in Broen, it's like, hey, this is Scandinavia, it just does not happen, these things. The wildest thing that happened is that Sealand gets shot off because of a suspected terrorism or kidnapping or whatever, and then nothing bad really happened anyway. Too dark, a very bleak society. And also very interesting when it comes to the characters and the women, they actually don't see them that realistic. They're even quite critical. Some of the especially female respondents were quite critical of the women. The women are always emotionally cold, fucked up, and really good at their work. You know, and like I would probably say that most Danish women would probably say we are emotionally warm, not very fucked up, and not so good at our work. You know, like, so it's really the Danish women did not see themselves in. They actually thought that this was not a way to portray a woman, that it was just not, and you can probably say that they might be right, and particularly they didn't recognize themselves in them, that's for sure, stereotypical. So that's why I was sort of thinking that there's a fantasy going on in international audiences, a fantasy that Danish audiences cannot jump onto, because we know how Denmark is, we know a little bit how Sweden is, and we know how Norway is, we know, yeah. So there's some sort of, there's like a fantasy going on, I didn't write that out, so I have to just, we have this thing called, where is it? Willing suspension of disbelief. That's when you know this is like watching Star Wars. Okay, yeah, I know it, but I'm going along with it. So it's almost like this is an unwitting or an unknowing, unsuspecting suspension of disbelief. They really, in a way, they think Danish society is like that. They think, and maybe this is due to the settings in a very, for most respondents, very unfamiliar milieu that most of the respondents don't know very well. And if they think they know it in a very stereotypical way. The realistic, and I think we shouldn't underestimate it, this very realistic aesthetics and the almost hyper-real Nordic settings. And the current themes, of course, the very current themes that we all know, immigration, women's stuff, and cross-border crime and stuff. And also accessible difference, as is what Jakob has talked about, the accessible difference. It's a difference that is not so, we can still access the difference as audiences. And then also very importantly, the extremely believable, subtle and authentic acting, I think, and characters. Yeah, so that's why I was sort of prompted to say, can we talk about a fantasy of realism and authenticity, and a fantasy of a better world and more equal world in international audiences, at least. At least it's part of the answer, I think. Yeah, and some of the things will be in this book. Some of them I'll discuss in this book. Yeah, that's it.